Have you ever imagined waking up in the middle of the night and finding a stranger climbing through your window? I was 12 years old and at a sleepover, thinking it would be all fun and games, until, at 3 a.m., I came face to face with a terrifying intruder. What happened next turned that night into a true nightmare. Want to know how we escaped? Don't miss a second of this chilling tale. When I was 12 years old, I lived with my parents in a modest house in the suburbs of a small Midwestern town in the United States. It was a Saturday in December 2005, and the air was heavy, not just from the approaching storm, but also from my excitement. My best friend had invited me to a sleepover at his house, something I had been eagerly anticipating for weeks. The phone rang in the late afternoon. I rushed to answer it, expecting to hear my friend's voice confirming our plans for the night. Instead, it was his mother. In a hesitant voice, she explained that my friend was grounded due to his low grades and couldn't have any visitors. My heart sank, but then she added something that changed everything. If you still want to come, you're welcome to. My son will stay in his room, but you can stay in the living room. I could hardly believe my ears. A whole night away from my parents, in a different house? It was as if the universe was gifting me with an unexpected adventure. Without hesitation, I begged my parents to let me go. After some reluctance and several promises of good behavior, they finally agreed. At 7 p.m., my dad dropped me off in front of my friend's house. The sky was already darkening, and heavy clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising a stormy night. The house, a typical two-story suburban construction, loomed imposingly under the faint twilight glow. I swallowed hard, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness as I walked up to the front door. My friend's mother greeted me with a warm smile, but I could sense a certain tension in her eyes. "Welcome," she said, leading me inside. "I've already set up the sofa bed for you in the living room. There's popcorn and soda in the kitchen, and you can watch TV until it's time to sleep." She paused, glancing upstairs briefly. "Remember, my son is grounded, so you two can't play together tonight." I settled onto the sofa bed in the living room, trying to enjoy my first night alone away from home. The TV murmured softly, showing an action movie that I barely paid attention to. My thoughts wandered between the excitement of being in a new place and the disappointment of not being able to play with my friend. Around 11 p.m., my friend's mother came downstairs. "It's getting late," she said gently. "Try to get some sleep, okay? If you need anything, I'll be in the bedroom at the end of the hallway upstairs." With one last tired smile, she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. I lay down, watching the shadows dance on the walls as car headlights occasionally passed by outside. The silence of the house was broken only by the constant tick-tock of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the wood. Slowly, my eyes grew heavy, and I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how much time had passed when I woke up suddenly. My throat was dry as a desert, and my thirst was almost unbearable. I looked at the digital clock on the DVD player. 3:17 a.m. I hesitated for a moment, but my need for water was greater than my discomfort. I slowly got up, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. Not wanting to disturb anyone, I decided not to turn on the lights. I cautiously made my way towards the kitchen, guided only by the faint moonlight coming through the windows. The house felt different in the darkness. The familiar furniture transformed into strange and menacing shapes. Finally, I reached the kitchen and, feeling along the wall, found the light switch. The sudden brightness blinded me for a moment. Blinking to adjust my vision, I turned towards the sink. That's when I saw him. At the farthest window of the kitchen, there was a man, a huge man. He was climbing through the window, half his body already inside the house. My blood ran cold. Time seemed to stop as our eyes locked. He was tall, muscular, with a hard face and cold eyes that stared at me with terrifying intensity. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stood there, frozen, like players in a terrible game of statue. Then, as if a spell had been broken, panic took over me. Before the intruder could finish climbing through, I let out a sharp cry and spun around, running desperately towards the stairs. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I took the stairs two at a time, shouting for help. I heard movement upstairs, doors opening. I reached the top of the stairs breathless, only to see my friend stepping out of his bedroom, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. Before either of us could say a word, his mother's bedroom door opened. My friend's mother emerged, her face a mix of concern and determination. She glanced at us, quickly assessing the situation. Without saying a word, she walked past us and headed towards the top of the stairs. That's when we heard them. Heavy footsteps slowly climbing the stairs. The intruder was coming after us. My friend's mother reacted instantly. "Get into my room now," she whispered urgently. We didn't need to be told twice. We dashed into her room, our hearts pounding wildly. She followed us in, closing and locking the door with a click that seemed deafening in the silent house. With quick, precise movements, she grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911. "There's an intruder in my house," she said with surprising calmness, given the circumstances. "I'm with 2 children. Please send help immediately." She provided the address and hung up. Next, to my astonishment, she walked towards the closet and took out a small metal box. She opened it swiftly, revealing a gun. My eyes widened at the sight of the pistol in her hands. She checked to make sure it was loaded and then positioned herself in front of the door. "Stay behind me," she instructed, her voice firm but gentle. We obeyed immediately, huddling against the wall opposite the door. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn, slowly at first, and then with more force when the intruder realized it was locked. "I have a gun," my friend's mother announced, her voice surprisingly steady, "and I will not hesitate to use it. The police are on their way. Leave now." For a moment, I thought it had worked. The sounds on the other side of the door stopped, but then, without warning, a deafening bang echoed through the room as the intruder started pounding on the door with all his might. My friend's mother didn't hesitate. She aimed at the ceiling and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small room, making my ears ring. Immediately, the pounding on the door ceased. We heard hurried footsteps retreating, descending the stairs. Then, the distant sound of breaking glass, probably the intruder exiting through the same window he had entered. We stood there paralyzed for what felt like an eternity. The silence was broken only by our ragged breathing, and in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens. The sirens grew closer, and soon we heard the sound of cars pulling up in front of the house. Authoritative voices shouted from outside, announcing the presence of the police. My friend's mother, still holding the gun, instructed us to stay where we were while she went to answer the door. We huddled together, trembling, listening to the sound of heavy boots climbing the stairs and deep voices conversing in the hallway. Minutes later, which felt like hours, a police officer appeared in the bedroom doorway. "It's okay now, kids," he said reassuringly. "The intruder has fled. You're safe." Slowly, we made our way downstairs. The living room was filled with police officers, some questioning my friend's mother, others examining the kitchen window through which the intruder had entered. A kind officer led us to the sofa and offered us cups of water, asking calmly about what we had seen and heard. The following hours passed in a blur of statements, phone calls, and the arrival of curious neighbors. My parents arrived just before dawn, hugging me tightly with tears in their eyes. As the sun finally rose, bathing the room in a soft, golden light, the house began to empty. The police officers left, promising to increase patrols in the area. The neighbors returned to their homes, not before offering support and sharing their own scary stories of sleepovers gone wrong. Sitting on the porch with my parents, I watched the quiet suburban street, so different from the chaotic scene of a few hours ago. My friend's mother joined us, looking exhausted but relieved. "I'm sorry your sleepover turned into one of those scary sleepover horror stories," she said, trying to smile. I looked at her, feeling a mix of residual fear and newfound admiration. "It's okay," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "You saved us." As we prepared to leave, I reflected on the night. What had started as a simple sleepover had turned into one of the most intense sleepover horror stories I had ever experienced. I realized that scary stories didn't always involve imaginary monsters or supernatural events. Sometimes true horror came from real-life situations, from very human threats. I got into my parents' car, exhausted but grateful. As we drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. That night would forever remain in my memory as one of the most real and intense sleepover horror stories I had ever lived through. But it also reminded me of the courage and strength people can demonstrate in times of crisis. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the now tranquil neighborhood, I knew that this sleepover horror experience had changed me forever. Sleepovers would never be the same for me. but I had learned a valuable lesson about bravery and facing fear. Have you ever felt trapped in a nightmare that won't end? It started as a fun sleepover with laughter and games, until everything changed. Imagine being chased by your very own friend. Or was she really your friend? Stay tuned until the end to find out how an innocent prank turned into a real-life horror movie. Are you ready for this chilling tale? I've always loved sleepovers. The thrill of spending the night away from home, sharing secrets and laughter with my closest friends. But on that night, what started as harmless fun turned into one of the scariest experiences of my life. My name is, well, that doesn't matter now. What matters is that I was 15 years old and living in a small town in the United States. It was a Friday night, and I was excited to go to a friend's house for a sleepover. We arrived around 7 p.m., carrying our backpacks filled with pajamas, snacks, and games. My friend's house was large and cozy, with a spacious basement where we planned to spend most of the night. There were 5 of us girls in total, all from the same school. But there was one, whom I'll call S, who always made me feel a little uncomfortable. S had a habit of making comments about my appearance that went beyond what I considered normal between friends. "Oh, the things I would do to you," she would often say, leaving me with a knot in my stomach. I never knew how to react, so I would usually just laugh nervously and change the subject. Once we all arrived, we started the night with the typical sleepover activities. We gossiped about the boys at school, did each other's hair, and ate more junk food than we should have. But then someone suggested we play a game of chase around the house. Little did I know that this seemingly harmless suggestion would set off one of the most terrifying nights of my life. One of those true scary sleepover horror stories you never forget. The game of chase began innocently enough. We ran through the house, laughing and screaming, hiding behind furniture and in closets. At first, it was fun, one of those typical sleepover stories that usually end in giggles. But gradually, I noticed that S was solely focused on chasing me. Her advances became more aggressive. At one point, she caught up to me and threw me to the ground with unnecessary force. I lay there, breathless, feeling the weight of her body on mine. She whispered in my ear, her voice laden with an emotion I didn't want to identify. The other girls noticed the shift in atmosphere. The carefree laughter turned into tense silence. I tried to get up, but S kept me pinned to the floor. "S, that's enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my growing fear. It was then that the others decided to intervene. In a swift and coordinated action, each of them grabbed one of S's limbs. A frenzied struggle ensued as we tried to immobilize her. S was surprisingly strong, thrashing and shouting as we attempted to tie her arms and legs. It took nearly 20 minutes to finally restrain her completely. Breathless and scared, we backed away, looking at S, who was now tied up on the living room floor. The silence that followed was deafening. None of us knew what to say or do. This had gone far beyond the bounds of a normal prank. It had become one of those horror stories that no one wants to live through. We tried to resume some sense of normalcy after the incident. We turned on the TV, pretending to watch a random show, but our minds were fixed on the figure tied up on the floor. The atmosphere was tense, filled with fear and uncertainty. It was as if we were living one of those scary sleepover stories we used to tell to spook each other, except this was real. Suddenly, we heard a sound, a creak, followed by a dull thud. It was no longer where we had left her. Somehow she had managed to free herself from the restraints. Panic set in instantly. Without a second thought, we all ran in different directions. The other 3 girls managed to get into one of the bedrooms, slamming the door shut behind them. Me, in my desperation, ran to the bathroom upstairs. I barely closed the door when I heard S's heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I locked the door and huddled against it as if my weight could keep her out. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn violently. "Hey, friend." S's voice sounded deceptively sweet. "Why are you hiding? Let's play some more." I didn't respond. Silent tears streamed down my face as I prayed for this nightmare to end. The banging on the door grew more insistent. "Come on," S shouted. "Open this door now." Time seemed to drag on. I don't know how long I stayed huddled against that door, trembling, listening to S's alternating threats and pleas. This was undoubtedly one of the most intense sleepover horror experiences anyone could go through. The hours dragged on as I remained curled up in the bathroom. The sound of banging on the door alternated with periods of eerie silence. My mind raced, trying to understand how a simple sleepover had turned into one of those scary horror stories we usually only heard about. Through the small bathroom window, I watched as the darkness of night slowly gave way to the dawn's light. The faint glow of the rising sun brought momentary relief. But S was still out there, her presence a constant threat. At some point during the wee hours of the morning, I heard muffled voices from downstairs. It was the other girls, whispering to each other, probably just as scared as I was. I wanted to shout for help, but the fear of drawing S's attention kept me silent. Exhausted and terrified, I eventually dozed off in the cold bathtub. My sleep was restless, filled with nightmares of S breaking into the bathroom. I woke up with a start several times, my heart racing, only to realize I was still locked in and safe. When I finally heard the sound of cars pulling up and adult voices, a wave of relief washed over me. The parents had arrived to pick up their daughters, unaware of the horror we had endured throughout the night. Slowly, my legs shaking, I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out. Downstairs, I encountered a surreal scene. S was sitting calmly on the couch, chatting with her mother as if nothing had happened. The other girls were pale and quiet, exchanging nervous glances. No one spoke about the incident in front of the parents. We gathered our things in silence and left, each of us carrying the weight of that terrible night. That sleepover had become one of the true scary stories we shared only among ourselves. A somber reminder that people we think we know can turn out to be completely different. I never attended another sleepover again. The experience of that night left a deep mark on me, transforming something that should have been fun into a source of anxiety and fear. To this day, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, the echo of those knocks on the bathroom door reverberating in my memory. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, paralyzed by fear because you thought you heard footsteps outside your window? Imagine this at the age of 11 during a sleepover with your cousin while your parents are away. What started as an imperceptible noise turned into a sinister presence and a red-eyed creature that made my heart stop. Want to know how this ended? Get ready, because this story will keep you up at night. I was only 11 years old when I experienced one of the scariest sleepover horror stories I would never forget. We lived in a typical suburban home on the outskirts of a small town in the northern United States. It was a summer night, and my 9-year-old cousin had come to spend the weekend with us. We were excited about having a sleepover, full of plans for games, movies, and treats. The night started off casually. My parents had gone out for dinner with friends, leaving us in the care of my 16-year-old brother. We spent the first few hours playing video games and devouring pizzas. When the clock struck 10 p.m., we decided to watch a horror movie, despite my cousin's initial protests. The movie was about a family being stalked by a psychopathic killer, and I must admit, it scared me more than I cared to admit. The shadows in the house seemed darker, and every creak of the wood made my heart jump. When the movie ended, around midnight, we were all exhausted and a bit on edge. We settled in the living room, my brother on the couch, my cousin and I in sleeping bags on the floor. The silence of the night was broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. I fell asleep quickly, my mind still filled with images from the movie. I don't know how much time had passed when I was suddenly awakened. My cousin was shaking my shoulder, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I sat up, confused and groggy, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I heard it, a strange noise coming from the backyard. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible. It sounded like rustling leaves, but there was something more to it, a nearly methodical rhythm that sent chills down my spine. I glanced at the digital clock on the shelf. 3:30 a.m. sharp. My cousin gripped my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "There's someone out there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I wanted to say it was just the wind, that we were imagining things, but the words caught in my throat. The noise grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, dragging footsteps. My heart was pounding so hard I feared the intruder could hear it. I glanced at my brother on the couch, still asleep, completely oblivious to the terror that gripped us. I wanted to wake him up, but fear paralyzed me. Then, my cousin did something that froze my blood. He got up and walked towards the window. I wanted to shout for him to stop, but panic had stolen my voice. With trembling fingers, he slightly pulled aside the curtain. The scream that followed was muffled by my hand over his mouth. His eyes were wide, fixed on something outside. When I finally gathered the courage to join him, I wished I hadn't. In the middle of our backyard, illuminated by the faint moonlight, stood a figure that defied logic. It was tall, absurdly tall, at least 7 feet. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, covered in something that didn't look like skin or clothing. It moved erratically, as if each step required tremendous effort. But what terrified me the most were its eyes, 2 glowing red orbs that seemed to scan every inch of our backyard. We backed away from the window, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. Whatever was out there wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was as if one of the scary creatures from the horror stories we used to tell at our sleepovers had come to life. "What are we going to do?" my cousin whimpered, his words almost inaudible. I had no answer. My mind screamed to run, to wake up my brother, to call the police, but my body refused to obey. We stood there paralyzed as the sounds in the backyard grew closer to the house. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. As the seconds dragged on like hours, the sounds in the backyard continued, now accompanied by a strange hissing, as if the creature was trying to communicate. My cousin was huddled next to me, silently sobbing. In a burst of courage, or perhaps sheer desperation, he decided we needed to act. With hesitant steps, I approached the couch where my brother slept. I shook him violently, my voice a hushed, urgent whisper. "Wake up! There's something outside." My brother woke up startled, looking around confused. Before he could say anything, a loud thump on the window made us jump. The curtain trembled as if something had crashed into the glass. My brother sprang up, finally understanding the severity of the situation. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice trying to sound firm, but betrayed by the tremor in his hands. He grabbed a baseball bat that was leaning against the wall and headed for the back door. I wanted to stop him, to tell him it was crazy to go out there, but the words stuck in my throat. The creak of the door opening sounded deafening in the silence of the night. My cousin and I huddled together, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the open door. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then we heard my brother's voice, a mix of relief and confusion. "What the heck?" He came back inside, holding something in his hands. As he approached, I saw that it was a bizarre, disproportionate puppet. "I found this hanging on the fence," he explained, examining the object with a mix of fascination and disgust. That's when it clicked. The nervous laughter started low, but soon we were all laughing hysterically, the relief mixing with the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. It wasn't a supernatural creature or a psychopath, it was just an elaborate prank. Later we found out that the teenage neighbors, knowing about our sleepover, had decided to scare us. They used ropes and a pulley system to move the puppet around the backyard, creating the illusion of a moving creature. That night became one of the true scary sleepover stories we told our friends, albeit with a mix of embarrassment and amusement. The fear we felt was real, even if its cause was fabricated. As the adrenaline wore off and the sun began to rise, I realized that sometimes the true horror doesn't come from monsters or killers, but from our own imaginations amplifying our most basic fears. That haunted sleepover taught us a valuable lesson about courage, paranoia, and the importance of staying calm in scary situations. The sunrise brought with it a sense of relief I had never experienced before. As the golden light began to bathe our living room, the events of the night seemed almost surreal. Sitting in a circle, still a bit shaky, we started processing what had happened. My brother, assuming the role of the older and responsible one, tried to reassure us with comforting words. "Look, it wasn't anything major, just a silly prank," he said. But I could notice a tremor in his voice that betrayed his own previous fear. My cousin, on the other hand, alternated between nervous laughter and apprehensive glances at the window, as if expecting the imaginary creature to reappear at any moment. "Do you think they'll try again?" he asked, his voice still laden with worry. As we discussed the night's events, I realized how our minds had transformed a simple puppet into a terrifying monster. The scary horror stories we had shared over the years at our sleepovers had come to life in our fertile imaginations, fueled by fear and darkness. "You know," I began, suddenly feeling older and wiser, "I think we learned something important tonight. Sometimes, the scariest things are those we create in our own minds." My brother nodded, a tired smile on his face. "Exactly. And we also learned the importance of staying calm and thinking rationally, even when we're scared." We spent the rest of the morning planning our revenge on the prankster neighbors, laughing at our overreactions and swearing to never again watch horror movies before bed. But deep down, we all knew that this experience would become one of the sleepover horror stories we would tell for years. When my parents returned, they found us exhausted but bonded by our nocturnal adventure. We decided not to tell them about the incident, keeping it as our little shared secret. Was what we saw that night real? Was it all in our heads? How could something like that be human? We never truly found out the truth behind that terrifying creature. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.